We are all seeking something, a drawing of ourselves that goes beyond conscious thought into the very core of our being, an instinctual, primal desire that defines who we are. This seeking, this longing, underpins all human effort and creativity throughout history and draws us to one defined purpose. Not too long ago, a discussion between Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson touched on this subject. If you have not listened to their conversation in full, I highly recommend that you watch that video in its entirety before watching this one. I'm going to go over some of the points addressed and add additional commentary and context, but I want to preface this by saying that both of these men do outstanding work in their respective fields and did an incredible job in this discussion. I hope this video only serves to continue the rich conversation that was had.
So the theory here is that there is something wrong with the structure of creation. That's its steepness in sin. And everyone has to ask if they believe that. And it seems to me that people do, is there's a sense that things aren't how they should be, that we're not how we could be, that something has gone astray and is continuing to go astray, which is a mystery in and of itself if it's a God-created world. It's like, well, why is that precisely?
Here we have a brief summary of the essential problem, as well as a setup for the need of Christ, or Messiah, in the Hebrew, both meaning the Anointed One, God's foremost chosen. Jordan Peterson, among many others, notices that there is something amiss with creation that goes beyond the human condition, even if they cannot fully express that. The mystery of God's fallen creation comes down to one thing: freedom. If you have free will, but do not have the option to make the wrong choice, are you truly free? Humanity was given that choice in the garden, with one option out of the countless multitudes, and we still chose it, allowing sin to enter into the world. The interesting thing that Dr. Peterson would be able to attest to through his clinic work and study is that making the wrong choice does not free you, but enslaves you to only making the wrong choices. Thus, we see the need for the Christ to save us and to truly set us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. Galatians 5:1. At another point in the video, Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson discuss and come to an agreement that if humanity never fell, Christ would have still came, but I disagree. Humanity would always fall. It is simply the nature of being given the choice, and with sin entering into the world, something else came with it: death.
That Jesus on the cross is offering the Father right praise on our behalf. And see, now you're getting to the Mass, which is very powerful. You know, the Mass is the great act of praise, where we join ourselves to the sacrifice of the Son, we say. We conform ourselves to Christ.
I have to ask you about that because it's just burning a hole in me. Well, I'm in chronic pain, a lot of it, and it's constant. And I don't know what to do with it, generally speaking. I know things that make it worse. You said something, a lot of ideas were flashing through my mind, and I want to hit at it because it's a crucial concern. You said something so surprising that Christ on the cross was offering up the proper praise to God. It's like, well, I'm not going to just let you say that without noticing it, because that's a hell of a thing to say. So I'm going to put together some things that you touched on, and then we can address this. So you said in the Bible, one of the things that's remarkable about it is the conception of the divine. So the conception of what is of highest worth is stripped from some of its obvious objects of projection: the sun, the moon, the cosmos, the stars. But then also earthly leaders of other cultures, idols, and also earthly leaders of your own culture. Says, no, whatever the ultimate divine is, it's not to be found in its fullest expression in any of those examples. It's something else. Okay, so then the question is, well, what is that else? Well, the Christian answer is, well, whatever it is, for in its human form, let's say, it's something human. It's something that humans can aspire to. It's both of those. And it's made manifest in the figure of Christ. It's something specifically human. But then you have this terrible paradox with Christ, which is partly the paradox that you just laid out, which is a very difficult thing to get a grip on. So what is it exact? Why is what Christ is doing proper sacrifice? Is it because what is it? His willingness to bear the pain?
Because we are separated from God, the source of all things good and true, by sin, not in anger or punishment, but in compassion, as evil cannot be in the presence of God. Once again, not for his sake, but for our own, as we would be thoroughly destroyed, God sought to rectify our mistake by sending his Son, who is of him, to pay the cost and defeat sin once and for all, to not only redeem us, but to redeem all of creation. This was alluded to since the beginning, as God, sparing Abraham's son Isaac, gave a replacement sacrifice, so too would Christ come and pay our ransom himself. The entire sacrifice tradition of the Hebrewic faith points to the crucifixion, and more so, even as Moses raised the bronze serpent, where we get our modern symbol of medicine, so too Christ had to be raised upon the cross, the blameless becoming sin for us, that we may be healed. For God ordained these things from before time, knowing we would fall, coming himself, in the form of Christ, to bear the heaviest calling and to have compassion on us. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. John 15:13.
So let's say Christ maintains his, I know this isn't exactly the right way of thinking about it, but it'll work for rhetorical purposes, I think. So Christ is tortured by betrayal, by physically and spiritually as well, because the best way to torment someone is to punish them despite their innocence, right?
Yeah, right.
So, right. Or maybe worse than that, to punish them because of their virtues. That's even better. And so that's intrinsic in the story as well. Christ bears up under that. He doesn't repudiate God, or doesn't repudiate his own essence. It's something like that. Then what is the example of that? Is the example of bearing up under that exceptional duress and maintaining a moral stance, is that the example that redeems the world? Is it that if you do that in your own life, the world is de facto redeemed?
We all have our own callings in life. Only Christ was capable of his, being the perfect sacrifice to end sin. But we are likewise to take up our callings with the willingness of Christ and share in his burdens. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing has happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. Therefore, let those who suffer according to the will of God commit their souls to him in doing good, as to a faithful Creator. 1 Peter 4:12, 13, and 19. Though we are not capable of redeeming the world ourselves, we can make it a better place by following the example of Christ in our own lives.
So now, in Orthodox Christianity, as I understand it, there seems to me to be more emphasis on the idea that it's each human's obligation to become like Christ. That's the goal. Well, that's that by definition, we could say, and we could speak psychologically about this as well. That means to become the ideal that's beyond rationality. Even that's what you're aiming at. That's what's hypothetically within your grasp. And it seems to me as well that that's what the Mass symbolizes, is that, and I'd be happy to have any objections to this, I would be happy to hear. The incorporation of the host is the embodiment. It's the incarnation of Christ within. That's what it's acting out. That's the idea. I mean, in some sense, it's the consumption of the saving element, but the saving element is actually a mode of being. And this isn't hit home. It's like, look what the church demands everything of you.
Yeah.
Absolutely everything. And the reason that people are leaving is because that adventure isn't being put before them. It's like, look, you can have your cars and your money and all of that, but that's nothing compared to the adventure that you could be going on.
The consumption of the saving element is actually paramount and a hard teaching, for at the time the disciples thought Christ was going to be an earthly king, and when he would reference and foretell what he must do, they did not understand it, or would mistakenly rebuke him. After feeding the 5,000, he spoke of having to eat of his flesh and to drink of his blood, and lost many disciples because of it. Even as he was breaking bread at the Last Supper and giving it to his apostles, they still did not understand that Christ was to be an offering for all, and this was the example he gave for us to live by. It is God who demands everything from us, but gives us everything in return. He fills our cup until it runs over, blessing those around us and pouring us out as a drink offering, that we may be filled and poured out again. And I agree with Jordan Peterson and Bishop Barron that this is not being articulated properly to the modern church.
I spoke in about 150 cities sequentially with a day or two in between, and to large audiences, 3,000 to 10,000 all the time, something like that. And I always paid attention to the audience singly, because I was always talking to one person at a time, but also en masse, to hear. Because if the words are landing in the right place and hypothetically emanating from the proper source, then there's silence. And sometimes that silence can be dramatic. And that's why people say, well, you could have heard a pin drop. It's no one's moving, because their attention is 100% gripped by whatever just happened. And one thing that reliably elicited that was the proposition that the meaning that sustains you and protects you from corruption during suffering is to be found in responsibility. And people that And I thought part of the reason that produced silence was because no one says that now. They say happiness, or they say rights, or they say privileges, or they say reward, or something like that. They don't say pick up the heaviest load you can carry, or care for that matter, and stumble forward.
Indeed, we are to carry the heaviest burden we can. Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Matthew 16:24. Here, not only is Christ foretelling of his crucifixion, but those around him would be aware of convicts carrying crosses in the street. And yet Christ says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden light." Matthew 11:29-30. We are called to take on great tasks, even unto the point of death, as we have an infinite source of strength and grace to call upon through the Holy Spirit in Jesus Christ to surmount these things.
All right, so let's look at the second one of those. So, it seems to me, I can understand this, not that whether I can understand it or not is a hallmark of its validity, but I have to try to understand what I can understand. I can understand the idea that bearing forward in a moral direction, acting as if being is intrinsically good, and that humanity as part of that is also intrinsically good, bearing all that up as a set of propositions, even in the most extreme cases of suffering, I can see that as a valid moral good. That's Christ's refusal to be, what would you say, corrupted by the injustice of his and terror of his fate. And so that might be something like, you don't have the right to become a tyrant no matter how badly you were tyrannized, let's say. And I think that's an unshakable moral proposition. But then there's the resurrection element of it, because I could say, well, the first thing I would say is, well, I kind of understand that psychologically. Parts of us die, and they have to die because they're in error. They have to be cast off, and we're reborn constantly as a consequence of our movement, our ascent forward. There's no movement forward without some death of the past. And so I can see the resurrection idea as a metaphor for the part of us that continues onward despite our failures and constantly reconstitutes our spirit. It's not something trivial, but then there's the insistence in the church of the bodily resurrection, which is, well, let's call that a stumbling block to modern belief. No doubt about that. That's something more than mere metaphor. And so you might ask, well, why is it insisted upon? Why isn't the proposition that you have a transcendent moral obligation to bear, to operate for the good of all things, regardless of your suffering, a hard line, no justification with the defeat of death necessitated? I'm not trying to make a fundamental critique of the idea of the resurrection, because I know there are things that I don't know. I know that for sure. And God only knows how the world is fundamentally structured. But it seems, and this is a Nietzschean criticism in some sense too, and a Freudian criticism, that seems in some real sense too good to be true.
Yeah.
So so what do you make of the resurrection? How do you conceptualize it, even as it's related in the Gospels?
The bodily resurrection is the fulfillment of the promise, the prophecy, and what was ordained. For if Christ was not raised from the dead, then what he claims is madness, as he did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, and even called himself God, but came and served none the less. Despite the moral example he may have left, the resurrection provides the divine example which we are not capable of on our own.
Well, you do have the following argument, which is that it isn't clear which is harder to believe, whether that happened or whether people made it up. Because if they made it up, that was really something. And that does strike me quite frequently reading the New Testament.
Yeah.
There are lines in there that hit so hard you think, it isn't obvious to me how someone could have just thought that up. So,
Right.
and there is that, well, and Jung, Carl Jung, who I greatly admire, he believed, I think in the same way that C.S. Lewis did, that, and he doesn't talk about this that much, but that there is this archetypal mythological pattern of the dying and resurrecting hero that has this psychological reality, which is extraordinarily deep, but that archetype was realized once in history. And that's fully realized. So it came from the mythic realm, let's say, the realm of eternal truth, the realm of pattern, instinctive pattern for that matter, and was fully realized at one point in history. And you might think, well, if it's going to be fully realized, it has to start somewhere. It can't start everywhere at the same time.
The Word, which became flesh, in the Greek, is logos, the source of all truth and knowledge. The Greeks had an understanding of the Logos, could conceptualize it, and knew of it, but did not know it. Christ is not merely from that realm, he is the fullness of it in man. The need of a Messiah is fundamentally written into creation so that all things point to Christ. Even now, most major fictions cannot go without an allegory, whether intentional or not, to the Christ, because what may be known of God is manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that were made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Romans 1:19 and 20.
So let's get back to the resurrection idea there, because again, see, that story to some degree doesn't require the resurrection to underscore his heroism. In fact, in some sense, well, that was motivated by faith in the resurrection, in some sense undermines the heroism of the action. And again, I'm saying I'm not trying to casually dispense with the idea of the resurrection, not least because of its undoubted metaphorical structure. But there is this crazy emphasis, this crazy idea that somehow bearing up under all that burden reformatted the entire structure of being. And that's associated with, I believe, and I'm no theologian, I believe that's associated with the idea of the harrowing of hell.
Belief in the resurrection is fundamental to salvation. That if you confess with your mouth the Lord Jesus and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Romans 10:9. Faith in the resurrection being the standard comes with a promise, though, that we will all taste death. It is an acknowledgement of our physical mortality, the horror of what we must all go through as eternally souled creatures, and a trust in the greater promise that lays on the other side. Death is not natural, however. Christ's sacrifice did not restructure the world, it reformatted it, redeeming creation to its original state, which will be fully realized upon his return. Death entered the world through sin, and Christ defeating sin renders it mute. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? 1 Corinthians 15:55. There is an underlying draw to God that defines everything we do, whether it is following that calling or running from it. Ultimately, every decision revolves around that choice, as God is the ultimate objective truth. Those who seek truth will ultimately find God as well, but that only comes through the Son. As Jesus said to him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. John 14:6. This is not to say that Jesus is gatekeeping people from God. On the contrary, he is the good shepherd opening the gate that was closed and rusted by our sin. He makes a way when there was none. For the need of Christ is clearly manifest in the world, as sin entered into creation through our action, and with it death. We were cut off from God, the source of all things good and true, and our callings confused and obfuscated. God came himself in the form of Christ to pay the sacrifice we could not, that we might partake of the saving element, to not only have salvation, but to pick up our own crosses and walk in the way that he did, so that others may come to know him until he returns and redeems all of creation once and for all. This is our calling in Christ Jesus, and the pull that every heart feels, to give God praise with every part of our being, and to live by the example he gave. Thank you to Bishop Barron and Jordan Peterson for their wonderful conversation that inspired this video. And likewise, I will be praying for both of you and Dr. Peterson's family. I know your family has been through a lot through these past 2 years, but I also know God works out all things for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose. I would challenge you in this one thing: taste and see that the Lord is good. To all those listening, I hope this video finds you well. Take care, and God bless.